And we're alive. Welcome to another episode of Roasting Marshmallows. My name is Pancho Gostowski, and today we have an interesting topic. I'm going to start with microservices has been one of the buzzwords of the last decade within the tech industry. It's a word that's been thrown all over the place, where it fits and it doesn't fit, and the supposed benefits of microservices have been used as an argument to reshape organizations, transform architecture, kick off startups, and exercise also the spirits of the scary big monoliths of the past. So all these attempts supposedly should help the organization scale up, bring them to the next level, whatever might that be, grow in services, revenue, people, size. This creates additional challenges which result in recruiting, training, priorities, focus, alignment, additional costs, which generally get resolved by adding more people, more developers to the teams. Our guest today has been a champion of the microservices domain over the last decade, who understands the benefit of microservices, but also knows they are not the silver bullets the industry likes to believe they are. He's a firm believer that there is a more stable way of growth that doesn't always require adding more people to the complexity. Is there a possibility for a slightly different strategy, which will still help organizations move forward in achieving their goals? Today we're roasting marshmallows with Phil Calçado, a blue belt jiu-jitsu practitioner. He has built engineering organizations for companies with 150 million users and almost no revenue, and for companies with $150 million of revenue and almost no users. So there is a story there behind there, I'm pretty sure. He has led the platform team at Meetup, WeWork, worked on Linkerd, the pioneering service mesh, and headed product engineering for DigitalOcean and SoundCloud, both pioneers in the adoption of microservices architectures. Currently, Phil works as a senior director of engineering at SeatGeek, where he leads the team that builds the live events platform used by 44 million people worldwide. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
How was this for an introduction?
I think it was good. Anybody who, there's a lot of people in tech, at least here in the US, who do jiu-jitsu these days. It's very kind of fashionable. And I must confess, blue belt's the second belt. So it takes a good few years to get there, but it's not as impressive as it might sound.
Well,
yes. And I joined with Phil today are two of my colleagues, Henrik and Sylvester. Hi, Henrik.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for joining. And I'm a Brazilian as well. And weird enough, I didn't go to the jiu-jitsu side of things. I did capoeira, but I had to Google what blue belt was like. Is this high or low? I don't know. Let me just Google it.
It's pretty low.
And Sylvester, well, welcome, Sylvester.
thanks, man. Looking forward to
You are
this
muted,
conversation.
Sylvester.
You're muted, by the way.
Wow. You're still muted.
This is like 2020 in one.
Yeah, it's like, okay, I guess once he figured out how to unmute himself, we can bring him back to the podcast.
Generally, I am the designated person that whose microphone and sound doesn't work, but thank you, Sylvester, for taking over this for me for a change.
Thanks, Pancho. Am I back
I was
now?
going to ask you, Sylvester. Hey, look at that.
Hey.
Welcome.
Hey, there's actually an issue with this UI because the button said enabled, so this time it's not my fault.
Yes.
Anyway,
Sure.
so thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation, actually. I have a lot of questions, and I'm really interested in learning how you organize departments that make all of this happen for these companies.
Wow, so I guess you kick off already, like the conversation. So what is your question?
So that's a good. That's a good. I was going to ask you what are you curious about, or what are you hoping to take out from the talk today, Sylvester? So maybe you can kick off with the questions you have.
Well, you're the director of big software departments, and what I'm curious to learn is, okay, how did you organize those teams, right? How do you ensure they stay productive? And because you're working for successful companies, so you're doing something very well. And I'm curious to learn. So how do you set up these departments, right? Because we talked to a lot of different people in this podcast, and we learn a lot about how should you organize companies, how should you do this, and a lot of it has been theory. So it's actually great to talk to someone that's actually doing this in real life and hoping to learn.
That's good. Yeah. So one thing that you mentioned, I've worked for successful companies. One thing you're going to see in my resume that's not by design, but it's one way or another ended up there, is that I kind of always work for the underdog. So SoundCloud versus Spotify back in the day. I guess Meetup we work as a different one, but LinkedIn versus Istio, the Google-backed service mesh. They had more investment in marketing than we had in funding, which is insane. DigitalOcean was a fun one because the only competition we had really was Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So
Only
not
that.
really a big deal. It's fine. And obviously at SeatGeek, SeatGeek's not a brand that well known outside the US. Although, for example, I know all you guys are in the Netherlands, but we have a lot of clients for your soccer teams. Our direct clients. It's just they use white label products, so you never see our logo anywhere. Same for the Premier League in the UK. I think we might do. I don't know if the Amsterdam Zoo, but one of your zoos is also one of our clients. We have a lot of clients at our zoo for some reason. And so, but back to your question, the way that a lot of this has influenced my thinking around staffing is that, anybody who works with me in these companies knows that I keep repeating the only competitive advantage we have is the speed of execution. Doesn't really matter if our product UX is great. UX is always a good lead into something. Like SoundCloud had better UX than anybody else. We basically invented the waveform that you see everywhere now. DigitalOcean also a great user experience. I'm an AWS user right now, and I think anything that requires a search bar for you to search the menu of an application is a little problematic. So we're dealing with a lot of these things on the UX side for DigitalOcean. But ultimately, in my experience, you hit a point where people start copying you over. Some people, Amazon, AWS, literally just straight up copied the DigitalOcean product in something they call Lightsail. It's basically the exact same thing. So when you hit there, what do you do? What's happening here? And throughout this experience, what I've learned is that you need to stick to your advantage, and your advantage is the speed of execution, how nimble you are, how quickly you can churn stuff out. So a lot of what I do when working with teams is really thinking about how can we get us to keep the same level of speed than when it was 4 people in a room somewhere, or at least something similar to this. Obviously, there's limitations that a growing company has. And throughout that, there's this technology side of things. You guys mentioned a little bit about the microservices side. One article I wrote about microservices a while ago, 6 years ago, touches on how the decision we had, that was back at SoundCloud, was really about an organizational change, not really technology change. There's only so much I care about the technology side of things. It was an enabler for something. And depending on the company, it's going to be different solutions. But one thing that I've seen, and I was really kind of against in philosophically until maybe 10 years ago, is how can you make sure that your basically product engineering folks can be focused on the domain and not worry too much about technology. Now, the reason I was really against this is, before SoundCloud, I spent 5 years working for ThoughtWorks, the whole agile kind of TDD heavy company. And what we saw over and over again, because we were working for big clients, is that you would get, Bank of America or something like that, and there would be these platform teams that it sounded like all they wanted was to prevent you from doing any work whatsoever. I remember one of my favorite days. I was in a project for Bank of America in London, funny enough, many years ago. And they had this system where you could search for what jar libraries you could add to your Java project.
Oh my God.
And if it wasn't there, you couldn't do it. And one funny thing I found is that because he also indexed transitive dependencies, I found the Scala.jar somewhere. So it's wait, if I do something about the compilation, because that doesn't include the compiler, I can actually use Scala because the runtime is there. So I spent a good weekend, and it's ridiculous. As a consultant, I was spending my weekends to make a bank more productive. But I was young. Anyway, so how to structure these teams in terms of platform has grown in my mind in terms of if you have a coherent strategy, it's fine. You should actually build this team that empowers other folks to do that. And throughout, my 5 years at SoundCloud, we extracted various layers of platform teams. It worked very well. But one struggle that I always had, even there, was how to manage these teams and these projects. If you have worked on the dev tool space, you see that a lot of it is really kind of old school, bottom up, big design up front. months and months and months for the smallest project. So I've decided to apply what I had learning almost 15 years in product engineering to that side of the business. I have I think 6 managers working under me now, and I try to strongly suggest that they read things like the user story mapping book, and we do a lot of workshopping and try to get back to the product side. So the way, like back to the initial question, the way I like to structure teams really is some enabling teams, which I generally call platform, but each company called it differently.
Yeah.
And then you have the vertically aligned with the feature, basically a feature team. What the concept would be, we can pretend that the Spotify model is true and say it's the Spotify model. But basically, you have these tiny teams. For example, right now we have a checkout team at SeatGeek that works based on this functionality, and they use the tools that we produce as platform. One thing that's interesting about some of these companies I've worked at is that this is when the domain is actually really complicated. I don't know if any of you has worked in the ticketing market space, but it's basically a hedge fund. It's just much less money. But there's a lot of interesting kind of pieces of information they need to correlate. The domain is extremely complicated. I remember that my first week, I think, at SeatGeek, I had to get somebody to sit down with me and explain what are sports leagues in the US, because they work very different from anywhere else I've lived. And also, I'm not really a sports person. This is extremely complicated domain. And if I can take out the kind of undifferentiated heavy lifting, I guess is the right word from these folks, it's great. But one thing that's interesting in my general philosophy is that I prefer to apply the paved road concept. So basically at SeatGeek right now, if you write code in Python, Go, TypeScript, and C#, funny enough, you use Postgres, Redis, and AWS, we use Nomad. So then you have a lot of things for free. We are working on even adding more stuff now, but you have a lot for free. If you, for example, our data team sometimes prefer Scala, we do not have JVM support as part of our platform. But what I do is to basically give them an AWS account with full privilege within that account. So you can go for it, we can help you, can consult, the more arcane details of the infrastructure. I'm not going to prevent you from doing that, but there's only so much I can afford as a department supporting every single stack. So there's a paved road. It works great if you follow that. If you need to diverge for whatever reason, way too often is a very valid reason, then you get to a point where you kind of on your own. But again, then it's where consulting comes more strongly from my historically my platform departments than others.
Okay, so there was a lot there, right? So let me go back to to part of the questions, because at least mostly like when we go to customers, I think is a similar thing what you mentioned about the bank you work in the UK, is that there is also a distinction between product people and IT people, or business people, commercial people. But it sounds to me that the companies that you are working on, this problem is not really there, right? Like SoundCloud or DigitalOcean. Like how, or do you guys need to structure this differently?
You mean how software engineering as a discipline is not the same as sales or other folks?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
They're siloed.
Yeah, the silos thing sounds different, like the way how is already by, I don't know, because maybe SoundCloud it grew with more like an engineering culture. But like, do you see a distinction between the companies you worked with and other like consulting companies in the past?
Yeah, like if you go to my time working as a consultant was very miserable in that way. I had come, so originally back in Rio, I was working for a TV station where we actually, had access to everybody, had access to the people who produce the shows, everything. And then as I had this stint as a consultant, like I said, maybe, I don't even remember Bank of America, but usually, I think this is one of the reasons that the industry has created this role of a product owner, because you really don't have access to anybody. So maybe that one person, and it's funny because it's all works. I think the most successful product owners I've worked with were way less about the skill they have, or even sometimes the experience. It's just they were people, and they were able to build relationships. So they would create, because they go for a coffee with this person or something like this, they would create this entry to break the silos a little bit. And then which would then bring the real requirements to us. Or maybe they would convince that one person to come to our demo every Friday instead of sending basically their intern because they did not care at all about that project. So this was a reality in most of my career working on corporate, both at ThoughtWorks and way in the beginning of my career. But funny enough, I've seen this happening in a few other companies as well. SoundCloud was a little it was a little easier for me because I was an early employee. I wasn't like a super early employee because I think SoundCloud was founded in 2008, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But I joined 2011, but we were maybe 40 people, most of them in Berlin. So that's when I moved to Berlin, lived there for 5 years. And I saw the the second HR hire. I saw, I interviewed a lot of these people. So I was able to kind of keep tracks of what was going on across the company. But if you contrast with, for example, which I worked more recently, like 3 years ago, it was like silos everywhere. Even within Meetup, which was my division, you had the business people on one side, the engineering on the other side, the product on the other side. And one thing that I try to follow within this is similar to what I was talking about product owners. I try to build a lot of these relationships and actually do talk to the business. Like if you look, people in the audio won't see, but behind me, there's a bookshelf, one of our bookshelves at home. And a lot of these books are actually, the kind of stuff you read on your MBA or your product management course. Because one thing I've learned from the beginning of my career is that I really need to speak the same language as these people. I cannot be the nerd guy in the corner doing nothing, like just talking tech. So I follow this mode. I try to break the silos, and the way I like to present myself, either when I'm managing a whole department or product engineering or platform, is this meme I have that engineering exists to create options for the business. So I like to sit down with the business person and say, hey, tell me about what we're actually doing here. And then I need to create a strategy so that I enable that. One interesting example at Meetup was I was in platform as well, and we were struggling. We're just like, sometimes I came to work and I had no idea what we were doing. I talked to my boss, talked to other people. There was not a lot of understanding, but there was this one person who was, the person who's always there I think he was the COO maybe. He was always there, all hands, and he was talking about the business and things like this. So I managed to get 30 minutes with him every second week or every month. And the first time I sat down with him, I was like, I need you to explain what your constraints are. I understand the all hands conversation on the big, let's change the word and blah, blah, blah. But tell me in business terms, what's happening here. And one thing I've seen from him back, this was 2018 maybe, is that Meetup had just been acquired by WeWork. WeWork had absolutely no idea what to do with Meetup. They just gave them a lot of money. And these folks from Meetup's a very old startup. I think they were founded in 2002. But they were not really a growth-based startup. They're a lifestyle business for most of their lives, and so generated some revenue. Everything was okay. WeWork injects a lot of money. I mean, I don't have to explain how crazy WeWork was in general, and these people had no idea what to do with the money. So they had all these ideas lined up, and they were terrified that everything takes so long that they had to pick the right idea to show to Adam Newman or whoever it was. So talking to this person is like, what if I can create a system or a platform so that you don't have to pick the right idea? You can actually try something out. I know anything here takes 3 months at least for one little page to go up. The Meetup website to this day looks super old. What if we can optimize for this kind of, basically, the lean startup concept? And that was a very good conversation. I came back to my desk, and I remember that maybe 2 days later, I was like having a coffee. My boss walks past me, and she looks at me and is like, "Look, I have no idea what you told Brian, but keep telling him that." Like, okay, I'm happy to. So that's kind of how I think about this a little bit. Like I talked a lot, but having this platform team is important, but it's really, really, really important to have this connected to the business, which, to be honest, is kind of the reason I came to platform. I'm kind of getting to a point in my career. I want to go back to working on product engineering. I had told this to my boss when I joined SeatGeek, but now I'm kind of way too deep in the platform space. I'll stay there for a while. I really want to go back to more product-related work. But I think that's where my experience, even consulting and trying to get close to customers and stakeholders, it matters a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
So, if I may, you're touching on a very interesting idea, and I think a common problem that everybody's been facing in this domain, being able to talk both the languages of, let's say, the tech people and the business people, sort of, if I talk more in these more old school traditional terms, just for the sake of painting the picture. Do you, and one of the things that we, between, well, the three of us and we are we've been discussing that, we've been all parts of various agile initiatives over the last, well, decades, maybe even decade and a half, and with various levels of success. And what we've noticed is that often these ideas seem to somewhere stop within somewhere around management. Would you say, has it been also your experience, and is it for the lack of speaking the same language there, would you say, or is it maybe not the same issues are being addressed that the management has that Agile attempts to solve?
You mean like the agile transformation stops by, I guess,
Yes,
like
yes,
mid management, like, maybe a director
Yes.
knows about it, but nobody else gives a shit. Yeah.
Correct.
So I think that's interesting. It's an interesting question. I don't think I've always have asked this question, but my first reaction would be probably two things. One, or the first thing is that as software engineering is a practice, and in this I'm including, maybe I should talk software product development, because I'm including like product managers, project managers, designers, what have you. I think we get too much in love with our own tools. And we have these big conferences where people discuss the fine details of prioritizing this backlog, and it's Kanban, not Kanban, what should I do? Oh my God. And it's fun, right? It's fun to geek out on this kind of stuff, and it can drive to super interesting things. But this to me is very similar. I'm a programming language nerd. I absolutely love programming languages and all the theory behind it. But this to me is similar to, I'm pairing with you and I'm discussing the type system and what kind of monad we should use here. And all you want to do is to frigging move this card from to do to done. So, I lost you in this conversation. I'm not talking to you. I'm just
Correct.
talking and you happen to be there. And I think this is a lot of what we do, not only in this particular example, but in technology. We're too self-centered. It got to a point where, we're so important to the world right now because everything's software, it's the word, blah, 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 that we kind of pretend other people don't exist and we don't bridge that way. And we also very opaque. It's very hard. It's much easier for anybody who's listening to this podcast to get some basic business education. You don't even need to get into the finance side of things, just like basic business, and try to speak that language. Then I try to explain to a CEO of a big company what a microservice is or why Kanban is better than this. This is going upwards is much easier in my experience than the other way around. So I think this is one part of that. And another one related is not being super focused on showing progress and showing the benefits of things. Especially in the corporate world, people are used to very long projects that might or might not deliver. They already hedge that risk. If a CEO of a bank or something, or CTO, CIO, has sponsored a project and that cannot fail, they should be fired because it's very likely the project will fail. So let's hedge our bets. Yeah, let's hedge our bets here. But as part of this transformation, or any transformation, to be honest, one thing I've learned is that you really need to make sure that your stakeholders see progress that they can relate to. If I tell you, hey, our MTTR was reduced from blah, blah, what does that mean? That, this is techie language. We understand that's a great number. You can tune different things based on this KPI. This is not the KPI anybody cares about. Funny enough, SeatGeek actually has MTTR as one of our core company-wide OKRs. KPIs. But that's mostly because that's part of our contracts with our clients. So when we just signed the Brooklyn ads here in Brooklyn, and they on the contract it says how much availability we should have. So it's pretty important. But usually you don't really see that. But what else do you see in your balance scorecard, KPI, OKR, whatever it is that you can relate to the work you do in both in some kind of agile transformation or general improvement of anything in tech. I think this is the most important thing. So basically, I'm blaming all of us for not doing the work of communicating upward at the proper level. We try to drag people to our little world and confuse the hell out of them so they get intimidated because nobody wants to it looks stupid. So they'd rather not go there at all and just delegate to a director that delegates to a manager that delegates to an intern that will come to your stand-up.
We forget basically the needs and the fears and the worries of some of the decision makers.
100%.
Okay, and like the part that also makes me then a bit, let's say, puzzled is, let's say you come to one of those companies and then you wanted to make this environment that they can experiment quicker, and then I guess depends on the size. One of your solutions would be like, let's go microservice, right? And a lot of people I can imagine might be like, why do we need all this complexity? And like, how do you justify that? Like, how do you speak the language on the top and how do you speak the language on the bottom? Like, what is your strategy on this?
That's I think I have two examples that are funny around this. One was actually at SoundCloud. I think it's implicit. We can add the show notes on this article I wrote about our microservices adoption back then. But I had been hired by this person, Alex Grossa, who's a good friend of mine to this day. Alex was great. Alex decided to leave within 1 year of my employment, and then I started responding to one of the founders, Eric, who was a super smart person. Used to be, he has an engineering background, but hasn't really done any coding or anything in so many years. He's a musician. He thinks music. But he's also a product thinker, right? He was the head of our product organization for a long time, and at some point I had to convince him or get some kind of permission, even if it was an email saying, okay, for us to do to work on some of the transformations we had to do. And I couldn't talk. He knew Rails enough because he literally wrote the first version of SoundCloud in Rails back in Stockholm in late 2000s. But he didn't understand anything else I was going to say. I was going to talk about the difference between interpreted programming languages and why Rails was behaving that way and why we should move to a faster runtime. That would just not be something he's even interested in. So the way I tried to frame it to him was that I went to, I don't remember if I had a slide deck or if I just drew this, but I kept look, this is one piece of thing that we need to do. I don't know, change the play button, blah, blah, blah. This takes 2 days. Out of these 2 days, or not 2 days, maybe let's take 5 days. Out of these 5 days, 3 days is wasted on these activities right here. I don't know, doing basically plumbing, things that are, the kind of stuff that's no value. And then these 2 other days here, then people actually writing the code. And this visualization and just going through the backlog over and over is similar to a little bit of the exercises we go for tech debt, I guess. But it's just this is the tax we're paying on every single feature in terms of productivity. And what I'm proposing is that we run first this one experiment, then that, and we already had a few successful cases around payments and push notifications that were built the way I was proposing things. And it's if you look at these systems or these teams, they're working that way. So we need to move it, from A to B, which was the way that I was able to convince the organization to give me basically permission. I think at this stage I was still an engineer, I wasn't even a manager, to go ahead and move on with these things. On the other hand, so this is a business/product leader that you need to convince, and I like to use terms that they care about. In this case, was productivity. It's almost always productivity, and time to market, whatever. But there's a few hacks, I guess, that one can use. I don't think there's any organization on earth who says, what we do very well here, we do cross-team collaboration very well. I never work in a company. Every single company is oh my God, we can't get anything done because cross-team collaboration. Exploit that. As a change agent, it's okay, how can I either change my idea a little bit or package differently or whatever it is that exploits this particular thing. And in this case, with productivity, time to market, like I said, we're a super tiny company in the music space, but it could be money that you're saving. It could be not having to hire more people, all this kind of stuff. So on the business side, I've often seen working like this. I have a different experience when I was at DigitalOcean, because DigitalOcean was founded by 2 brothers here from Brooklyn, and they I don't think they have an engineering degree, because I think they're like school dropouts, but they were building data centers, racking up data centers since like '98. So
Wow.
they knew everything about Linux operating systems, how to actually rack a data center. I don't know. I've only been data center so many times in my life. Um,
I've never been to
so
one.
right, like
No.
the CEO who was my boss, and we're talking about a CEO of a company that was clocking in $200 million revenue per year. He in some of our one-on-ones, I remember he was like, Phil, I have a question for you. I'm very worried. I was like, okay, what's up? I hear that we're using Kubernetes, and I don't really understand why you're using Kubernetes. I'm like, oh shit, there we go. Like, oh yeah, how do I even approach this conversation? Because I knew that this guy knew enough about the Linux and the virtualization layer because we had used KVM and whatever other things to create the droplets in
Yeah.
DigitalOcean. So I spent like 5 seconds on the technical side of things because I didn't even know if he was going to understand. He had been out of the nitty gritty of tech for so long. But then the challenge was to drag these executive from the technical side back to the business side. So it's kind of the other way around. If I was like bringing tech to business, I was bringing business to tech on this one. And start talking again. It was a conversation about time to market and reliability and the things that we wouldn't have to build ourselves. But my time at DigitalOcean was often funny that way, where everybody who was like a product leader, my boss, everyone else was a very hardcore like Linux is up. Um, and
Yeah.
I did not had no idea about software engineering whatsoever. Like they didn't I think they wrote Perl,
Oh boy.
but that
Cool.
was it.
Cool. So did they end up using Kubernetes still, or?
Oh yeah, like
Oh,
so I'm DigitalOcean now has a Kubernetes product, even funny enough,
yeah, I
and I think
noticed.
they have one or two Kubernetes committers on staff. So they really heavily invested in the container side of things, Kubernetes, all this kind of stuff. Everything internally runs on containers. To my knowledge, it's been a long time since I left DigitalOcean.
Okay.
What do you think about like? Do you think a director of engineer can not be technical?
Good question. I think it's a so I think a lot about this question, and as I grow older, I'm trying to revisit all of my bias. So I want to scream at you, no, but then I will take a step back, have a sip of my coffee, and think about it. I think it can be, but I don't think it should be. Maybe it's a scenario that's a little different. I've had in my life one concrete experience with somebody who was an engineering leader who was not related to engineering at all. And it's funny because this person, not gonna name names for obvious reasons, but it's actually pretty famous. They give talks, they write books about engineering management. Their resume is very obscure in terms of what they've done at each company. But this person is not, I don't even know what the background's like. It might be UX or something, but they moved into engineering. And I've inherited 3 teams that were owned by this person. And it was one thing I can tell you, they were the most organized teams I've ever worked with.
Oh,
Everything in terms of process was perfect. I felt ashamed because I'm a very messy person. And everybody who works with me knows that there's only so much they can rely on me for like bureaucratic red tapey stuff. And I was like, oh shit, I need to get my stuff together now because this is not little league anymore. We're playing the real game. But then when I looked at the tech side of things, it was a little wild. It was like it's funny. One thing I've seen happen a lot is that either because the person doesn't have experience, just experience in life, they're still
yeah.
starting on their engineering career, or they're making a lateral move, like from something else to engineering. They kind of reinvent waterfall a lot. I think
Yeah.
maybe we're just fighting gravity here. Maybe waterfall is the way to go because it's the only way that our brain works.
I don't
Because
know.
these
No,
people,
no, let's not go
like,
there.
I don't know, like, no, for real, hear me out. Everybody reinvents waterfall. There's got to be a reason for that. So these folks were working on. There was one particular team that was working on the spec of some kind of system for maybe a year, and the system sounded very complicated when they described it. So when I first joined this job, I was worried about 35 different things. Like, okay, this sounds complicated. You guys keep going. Sounds like you're doing well. You're super organized. Like, I'm sure you're doing well. And then eventually, fires were not so problematic in some other teams. I actually looked back at this team, and you're like almost literally moving one text box from one page, server side page, no React, nothing, from one page to another page. It's just like to do that, they've created this whole thing. And I'm like, yeah, this is, if somebody had, even if you don't write code anymore, I mean, I don't want to be the guy who goes around the office and said, oh, back in my day, I'm sure this is just an if, even though I haven't written code in 5 years. But you build the instinct. You know that this cannot be that hard. And even if I don't know, like that happens a lot on mobile and front end. I don't have mobile teams anymore under me, but for a lot of my career, I was managing mobile teams and web platform is a team I have right now, and I have great people on that team that I trust because, to be honest, I don't know a lot about front end development and app development at all. But if something comes to me and it's a 1 year project to move this text box from A to B, there's a bad smell there. So I mean, I'm not going to
Yeah.
challenge you, but I'm going to ask my network and say, hey, what do you think of this? And try to find ways to get there. I think it's not impossible that somebody who is not technical can do that or was never technical, but maybe it's like getting me to be a CFO somewhere. I'm sure I can learn a lot about it, but I have zero experience. So if somebody is like laundering money, I won't be able to look like, oh wait, this looks weird. I never saw a book like this before. I was like, no, I won't have that instinct.
But is that the responsibility of the manager actually to validate? Okay, is this estimate, because that's what you're talking about, different topic altogether? Is this something that the managers should validate, or is it more like, well, shouldn't the team find the quickest way to solve the business problem? So
that's a very interesting question, because I think it like ends up being what's the role of the manager, which many different schools of thought. So in this particular case, I think it's a good example of what I like to do with my managers, which is I like to play with this accountability and responsibility thing a lot. Anybody who works for me keeps hearing these words all the time. It's funny because in English they kind of mean the same, but we pretend they don't. In Portuguese, they kind of mean the same, but we pretend they don't. So I like to define accountability is basically the person who owns an area, and if this goes bad, it's on you. Like you need to own it. The buck stops there, as they say in the US. And responsibility is the act of doing something. It's a very kind of wishy-washy definition here, but what I want to say is that the manager is accountable for whatever initiative is going on. They are not necessarily responsible for it, and a good manager and a more experienced manager will delegate more and more of the responsibility to the team, but ultimately somebody needs to be accountable for that, because otherwise you're treasury of the commons. It's like, oh, I didn't want to say anything because it's my peer, and I didn't want to say, and maybe you have a very healthy team where people call each other out and they work well and it's fine. It's not always my experience. Way too often, people focus on their own stuff. And I'll tell you more, it gets worse if you apply some of the Silicon Valley performance management processes, like Google style, where you measure by your individual contribution. So I don't give a shit what anybody else is doing. All I want is to implement the new version of protocol buffers or whatever it is that these folks are doing.
Yeah.
But then somebody, the accountability needs to go somewhere. And as a manager, or at whatever level, that's where I think if you think something is funny, you need to ask the questions, you need to validate your understanding, and it's perfectly fine for you to reach out to your network, internal or external, to revalidate ideas around this, whatever is being worked on. But that's how I like to frame managers. I am very, very, very against these kind of, I'll call it new agey, just to be offensive, new agey way of thinking of managers as gardeners of people. If I need my managers to be gardeners of people, I'll hire people who actually have degrees on how to build relationships and coach people, like coaches and psychologists and all that. I don't need somebody, back to the first question, I don't need somebody with software engineering experience, or if all you're doing is coaching and growing people, I don't need you that skill. I actually would much rather have somebody who runs how to have a one-on-one conversation, because they've been doing that for a very long time. Don't care so much about the technical side. Managers, for me, they need to basically work on the three things: the people management side, the delivery side, which you can call project management, but I like the word delivery better, and the technical side as well. Now, should they be the best at any of these things? They don't have to. If they are, it's great. If they're not, whatever. But as a manager, the biggest role is really to delegate the responsibility down, but ultimately be accountable for what's going on.
So I
if
think
that project's not happening, or it's not going to deliver, it's on you, and you need to either ask for help or ask questions or whatever it is.
yeah. So I think the part that triggers me on this is more about like because I hear this quite a lot also in discussions on Twitter on other people, and they always mention about this accountability. Then you are accountable. Then for me, it's always like, what does it even mean? Like, okay, you are accountable, so you get fired. You like, what does it really mean for your manager or for you? Like, you are accountable. What are the consequences that I should like picture in my head?
So, like for example, right now at SeatGeek, we just hired a new head of HR, so this might change in 6 months. But the way we go about things is that we do have a performance review process where your score meets expectations, exceeds expectations, all this kind of stuff. My expectation on a manager, like say a mid-level manager, is that they are going to be able, not necessarily to deliver on everything that they have to, but if something is going badly, they will be able to stop before it hits a wall and pivots to add more people, remove people, change the whole project scope, whatever it is. If you don't do that and you're accountable for the initiative, then you're not meeting my expectation. So we're talking about performance. You might need to have a performance conversation. You might need to, maybe I've done this a few times successfully in my career, that maybe you should not be a manager. Maybe, you know what, you're so much happier as a designer, an engineer, or whatever it is. How can I facilitate you move from this management role to something that makes you happier, and you don't have to be on the hook for this kind of stuff? And then that applies to me as well. I'm ultimately accountable for everything that's happening on my department. I don't know everything that's happening. I don't even know how many teams and how many people. There's a lot going on. But every second week I sit down with my managers and we do portfolio management. We go through every project and we, is this on red? Is this on yellow? Is this on green? If it's on red, then I know I need to pay attention to that and support my manager working that way. If it's green, I basically don't need to look at all, which I'm very happy about. But I think that this conversation, the accountability that's given, needs to be tied to basically a conversation about your performance. And I've seen it, especially in large organizations, where it's not really. So there's no consequence. It's like a I don't know, one of a Marvel movie, right? Or like somebody dies and there's no consequence really.
Yeah.
It's just like what it's hard to grow attached to that character because it doesn't matter. So this is where I think the company needs to build culture. And one thing I'm going to tell anybody struggling with this, listening to this talk, is that don't think that this needs to start from the top. You can, if you have a team of 3 people, you can create that culture within your team. If you have a whole department, with the department. If you own all of engineering, great. But this is the kind of stuff that you can do a lot locally instead of trying to wait for the company to change or for some new leader to come or whatever it is. There's a lot you can do internally.
So there was a lot of things you mentioned there, and I think I can ask like a dozen of questions.
Sorry, I talk too much.
Well, not necessarily
it's a coffee.
Is it?
No, I just talk too much.
You said it. But there is one thing that I kind of caught my attention, that you kind of had a theme through the things you just talked about, the performance and the evaluation of people. I think you also mentioned how they did it in Google, like individual performance evaluation, and through all these different companies that you've been through, you've probably come across different models of doing this. What in your experience works? Well, I don't know if the best is the right word, but which one would you prefer to have for your own teams or your own departments?
So I like the idea of this conversation about expectations. But one thing that's interesting is that when I'm assessing performance, the most important thing to me is that I need to assess your performance against your job description. It's very easy for a manager to, you work for me and I know you're a great person. I know you're so talented. Oh my God, like you're going to be so successful, but you're not meeting the expectation for you that I have in my head, which is completely different from your job description. I hold you disregard. And I say, oh, you're underperforming because you're not fulfilling my own desires for you. So this to me is a coaching conversation, not a performance conversation. When I'm looking at performance, I'm like, your job description is, hopefully you have some kind of level system or something like that. There's a lot of good open source ones that companies can adopt these days, but this is the expectation for a person at your level, and I'm going to assess you against that. So this is one step, like working at the individual level. I like something that is actually, I believe might have been created at Google, which is the calibration sessions, where different teams sit together and they go through the performance reviews. One thing that I find interesting on these sessions is really that it's like what we talk about vaccinations these days, right? I think everybody learned a lot about vaccination over the last year and a half.
You hope.
In Brazil, we and yeah, I live in the US, not everybody, unfortunately. So one thing that I did not even think about ever is that vaccination is not about you, it's about society. It's really like improving the game for the community. And to me, calibration needs to be about that. Calibration, it's basically you get everybody in a room, or managers, whatever you want to slice, and you go through everybody's review and everybody's performance review, and you try to figure out, if you're all grading people accordingly at the same level. You all have the same expectations, or at least ballpark
Sort of
around
an
things like
internal
that.
benchmark.
Yes. And one thing that my biggest pet peeve on this process is people who use this as a session to give feedback. Like, oh, but this person cannot be meet expectation because that day in 2013 they said this. It's like, dude, you didn't tell me this. What do you want me to do with this information now? Like, seriously. So you work with what you have. I usually ask my managers to write I would say it's probably like 2 paragraphs. They tend to be very specific about projects, calling out specific things, sometimes linking to different artifacts. And then, whatever way you rate a person, let's say you rate meet expectations, someone. And I asked all of them to, as the last part of the performance review, to write why not higher and why not lower. Because that to me is exactly what gives me what you're thinking about this role. So everybody sits together, go kind of plots people. It's unfortunate that's hard to do this remote these days. But for example, when I was at DigitalOcean, I had a very remote team. Managers were remote, but I would fly everybody to New York. We would get a room somewhere and actually plot people on a whiteboard because humans are visual, so it's very easy to see. Oh wait, Martha and Bob are super close, but Martha, the perception is that she's doing much better. What's happening here? Is this just our expectations collectively are off? Is that what, it's a bad smell again. Like, let's unpack this, have a conversation about that. So again, like this language around expectations towards a job description is the first step. Calibration is extremely important. And then it comes a part that, to be honest, I really don't have a good, I'm not necessarily a solution, even thinking around, which is really how do you apply variable compensation. I haven't worked for a public company in a very long time. I was an underdog. I'm always preparing for an IPO. Let me put it like this. But
Didn't get lucky
one
yet.
thing, no, yeah. One any day I had so much SoundCloud stock you wouldn't believe. Anyway, you get to this point where in the US, I know that in Europe, I know the Netherlands, but I do a lot with Germany still, and I know it's getting more and more of the case there. If, for example, if you work for Google, you make more than half of your compensation is in stock, and a lot of this is variable based on your performance assessment. It's funny. My girlfriend actually spent 10 years at Google as a software engineer. She moved to Shopify recently, and I remember we were on a ski trip somewhere with a lot of friends of hers from Google, and she happened to be doing some work on the computer during vacation, and people were like, "Oh wait, is that performance review going on? Are you going for promo? What's going on?" Because for you to be working that late is because you definitely need some some boost on your compensation. So a lot of these. My point is, a lot of this variable compensation based on stock and performance drive all sort of weird behavior. I have a good friend of mine who was working for, I think it was Uber or Lyft, and he got in trouble on his performance because he spent way too much time, in quotes, coaching the new junior engineer in the team instead of delivering on his own project. So ultimately, he was making the team more productive, but it doesn't matter. His manager knew that. It's like, no, I understand. I fully appreciate this. But unfortunately, the way this process works is that I need to demonstrate, again, with links and whatever, pull requests, how you contributed to this thing. I don't have a good, even intuition around what's the best way to go about this. I like the way that, that's very much the thought works in me still, like, how can we make it work for a team? Even if compensation variable, like how can I make the team benefit from that? But obviously this also opens another can of worms. It's just, it's a short blanket situation a little bit. But the thing I would try my best not to do is the individual performance that, Facebook, Google, all these big tech companies do. I have never seen this drive into anything good.
Yep.
Sounds like a case for a small experiment, Phil.
But
The problem is that
I do
small
have a
experiment
question.
involving HR. It's always
Hey!
a small experiment.
The size is relative to your position, man.
No, but like,
Using my words against me. I like it.
no, but like, so this also triggered me a few things, right? Like, so for example, when you talk about like connecting a bit of the dots here, you mentioned like, okay, it's all about speed of, let's say, delivery, right? And it's about not per se this long project that might gonna fail. It's a lot about trial. So I can imagine that, let's say, you achieve that architecture style, you achieve those feature teams that are running a lot of experiments, but I just imagine the situation where you have this team or this manager that they are working very heavily and they running a lot of experiments, but they just did not hit any run, like they just like missed everything. But in my eyes, they are extremely successful. But I can imagine by the point of view of like this evaluation of calibration, whatever, they just suck at their job. But not in my, so like how would you guys compensate this? Because they are running quite well. And yeah, do you understand my question?
Yeah. So I mean, the way I'm understanding is how do you foster a culture where failure is actually a good thing,
Yeah.
because you're trying things out, and not necessarily individual, but performance in general.
Yeah.
I think the way I think about this is that there's different levels to this conversation, right? It's similar to I was joking about banks hedging different projects, but it's not that much of a joke, because, for example, as a director right now, I have a few teams under me, and my goal, either given by my boss or self-imposed or whatever, is to move this metric from A to B. That's and as a as a senior management person, nobody's going to tell me how to do it. It's going to be like, I don't care, like, you just do that. And I have all these folks working for me, sometimes hundreds of people, and I was like, okay, how can I distribute that in a way where it's more likely for me to achieve this goal or get this close to this goal? Oftentimes I'm running 2 or 3 different initiatives that ultimately will, in my head, impact that metric in different ways. Maybe they all deliver and I'll have like 150% of that number. Great. More often than not, they will probably be a little under, because my managers historically has always given me some unrealistic goals, so I play with what I have. But then as it cascades down, it cannot be like that. I cannot hold an engineering accountable, an engineering team accountable for moving this metric from A to B. What I need them to do, thinking about them as I hate using the word resources for people, but I can't find a better word right now. But like the tools and resources I have are the teams I have. So how can I create this incentive system so that they can churn experiments quickly? And if I have to pivot something, I do that as soon as I possibly can. So to me, or at my level, or maybe a manager working for me, the metric will be very specific around, you need to move things from A to B. And this is something that I think people need to be comfortable as they grow up hierarchically. Like, you need to own that. But then you also need to be given freedom to shape this in whatever way makes sense to you. If you're like a first level manager in a team, that might be the way you want to shape a backlog or initiative, streams of work or whatever. If you're a senior management maybe and have a few teams, you might want to just make these teams work on different things, maybe the same thing, but different attempts at that. And I'm hoping that at the engineer level, it's not. I mean, ultimately, everybody needs to be connected to the main goal. This should be intuitive to everyone. But I want to reward people for, again, like what you're talking about, the churn and experiments. How can we get this out? We validated 10 different ideas. None of them worked. That's great. As for an engineer, or for an engineering team rather, like a feature team or whatever, that sounds like great work, guys, awesome. For the manager, it's like, okay, what was your plan B, and what happened to your plan B? For the manager above that, it's just like, okay, what were your 35 plan Bs that you had to have to move from A to B? I know sometimes things don't work and they fail, and that's fine. But at different level of hierarchy, you need to have different, again, like job descriptions that I measure yourself against. And again, I've moved a few people in my life from manager, well, lots of people from engineer to manager, a few people from manager to director, and this is the biggest struggle. There's somebody I coach, a good friend of mine I've worked with in the past, and we were talking the other day because it's a problem she has right now, is that she has a blank sheet of paper. She never had it in her life. The idea was you need to move this thing from this number from A to B, and she's freaking out because like, oh my god, now I need to like slice this into projects and initiatives. Like, how does that even work? There's nobody teaches you that. This is not something you develop intuition for. It's a different role from being a first level manager and 100% different from being an individual contributor in a team.
Yeah. So now, like, what is triggering me is we had a talk with a guy. His name is Niels, and I would say his talk was very influential to me. Let's put it like this. And a lot of the things that he debates is exactly about those, let's say, rewards or incentives, and like all those should be gone. Like, no, you never do this. You do not evaluate people. You do not do any of those. And his suggestion was about, yeah, you kill bonus, you kill all that, and you basically share profit cord like equally to everyone. Doesn't matter if you're a director, a manager, or a tech lead or a developer, you all get the same share from the, like, what is your take on that?
This is, you just had this person, I don't think I know this person. They are from Towerx? They still at Towerx?
No, it's just, he's a consultant, he has in the
Right.
podcast. I can send the link later, but it's interesting
So,
conversation.
I mean, I don't know this person at all, and I'm very interested to hear, but I'll not always. I often see this kind of conversation coming from consultants, or somebody who was a consultant for 10 years in different
Yeah.
companies. And when you actually work on the product organization, where you need to hire, you need to keep those teams working on things, it can get a little more complicated than even what I was telling my customers as a consultant. But again, most of my customers were like banks and stuff like that, so
Yeah.
it's a whole different world. But when it comes to the realities of a mid-sized company, is a little different. For example, share profits. Good luck with that. What profits? Like we basically, well, SeatGeek's different because SeatGeek's a profitable company, and DigitalOcean was as well. But at SoundCloud, like I don't remember if it was you or one of you guys mentioned that kind of snarky thing I have on my bio around the companies I built for 1 million users or $1 million. Because SoundCloud, I left, we had 300 million users. We didn't make enough money to pay for our office in Berlin. Like there was just not enough money for that. It's a very beautiful office though. But DigitalOcean, I remember my first day at DigitalOcean, I was walking around the engineering floor and I saw dashboards everywhere. I was like, oh, that's exciting. So I was like, oh, what is this graph here? I was like, oh, it's calls to the API. And I was like, cool. What's the unit of measurement? I was like, what do you mean? Like, no, it's just like 1,000 requests per second, million requests per second. It's requests per second. And it just blew my mind because I was coming from a company with 200 million users with like bajillion requests per second to, I don't know what the number will be, I'll misrepresent it, but it's like 60 requests per second. I was like, holy shit, maybe I made a bad decision and I should not have come work for this company. But then I realized that each one of those 60 requests per second had a dollar value to it.
Yeah.
Whereas at SoundCloud, each like somebody clicks on a track got us no money whatsoever. So, different companies can do it differently. Mid-sized companies, in my experience, are very, very complicated to do when it comes to how you reward people that way. Or you can say, you can always give them stock. It's complicated because these things need to be approved by the board. So that's the kind of stuff that's impossible to try locally. You need to have a whole program coming from the company. You need to make sure there's an allocated pool of equity for this kind of stuff. And it's a lot of work to backtrack. So companies don't try to do that. But all that said, I gave you a lot of like wishy-washy things about why I think this is a bad idea, or not a bad idea. Like, what is it not as easy?
The challenge,
as somebody might be
the challenge. Try.
But the real big challenge right now, I'm going to tell you in terms of recruiting, and this is worse right now with remote becoming a bigger thing, is that's not what your competition is doing. So unless that person really, really wants to work for you, good luck trying to sell them this idea where Google is offering them 3 times more to do basically a lot less work. So that's the challenge we have right now. Even at SeatGeek, we're not a public company. We want to go public soon. But I don't. The compensation I give people is stock options and base salary. Our base salary is pretty good, but if you get the total compensation of not even Google, like a company that mid-sized company that's public, it's going to be more because stock is actual money. So this is where a lot of these models are more idealistic, and when rubber hits the road, it's like, oh shit, yeah, great. I have this great framework, cannot hire anybody except that one person who really likes this idea. This is where I think things get a little more complicated.
Okay. I'm actually thinking we should try to get both you and Niels Vlaagner, that was his name, on a podcast sometime, because I think this is going to be the best discussion ever. But
Happy to.
yeah, or listen to the previous podcast or something. But he
Yeah.
has some valid ideas, and I really like the difference in perspective here.
No, but like,
Could
okay,
be,
so
very.
but me too. But we can definitely arrange that. But now I have another question because we were hitting the hour, and I think that was actually the title of the podcast, of this episode at least. Like we've seen quite a lot of companies as well when we consult, like the big ones, that they just like growing the number of developers, growing the number of teams, and you just don't see them delivering anything. But the teams are growing and growing. And you said also like, okay, and you have a different strategy of not per se having to grow the number of people to actually grow your business. Like, can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a topic that it's been a big passion of mine for the last years. I need to write about this. But one way that I like to talk about it is my experience joining DigitalOcean. I decided to leave SoundCloud like mid 2015, and I was lucky that I had they gave me so much leeway in my transition period. I basically literally wrote on Twitter, like, I'm looking for a new opportunity, and I talked to a bunch of people. I was living in Berlin. I came to New York City, talked to a few companies, and one of them was DigitalOcean. Joined the company, come in, first day, I have my one-on-one with my boss, which is the Kubernetes guy, Ben, and I clearly recall, I was like, okay, so what do you, as I join the organization, I like to sit down with people and say, what do you think I should pay attention to, and what are the things that I can postpone learning about? Like, what's the hot buttons right now? And Ben looked at me. Ben's like this tall, New York Russian guy who's lovely but can be really intimidating sometimes. And he looks at me as like, as far as I'm concerned, your responsibility, your task here is to hire 150 engineers in 1 year. I'm like, okay. So, and then my head was like, what are these people going to do? What's it? Okay, cool. All right, I will unpack this. And throughout time, I realized that basically the problem they had is back then DigitalOcean had only maybe one product, two. It had the droplet and floating IPs, and we needed to get to a point where it was like cloud complete with a few different products that they wanted to be part of this suite. This is what the actual goal was, but the goal had been given like we had to hire this many people. So that's a little crazy. So what I've done in unpacking this is exactly like looking, okay, we do need to hire people, so I changed the whole hiring process, but I also needed to look at the tech and the strategy and the product development cycle and things like that were hindering us. So instead of just adding more people to a problem, there were many other things that we could do to speed up the delivery. My favorite example is, so DigitalOcean released load balancers as a product in 2016, I think. That was a project that I was end-to-end part of. And the first idea that they had in mind was basically to write a load balancer from scratch. There were some research papers and things like that. And I looked at that, and working with a few folks I had worked in the past, like some of them coming from ThoughtWorks, it's like, why don't we just package HA proxy? Like, what we run it in a virtual machine, and we don't have to write it. And the whole company is like, hardcore hacker culture is like, oh, it's gonna break, it's not going to be. It's like, great, let's do that as a first pass. Let's have MVP, if you will. Like, let's do that. And that was what we went with. So the first, really, I have no idea what it runs now, but I know that at least up to, I want to say 2 to 3 years ago, it was still basically the same design. We're still running HA proxy, and it was fine. So basically, the product was we configure HA proxy for you, not we have this fantastic thing.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff that we were able to do to get people to achieve the goal without just adding people. We did hire 100 people, maybe, I think it was about 100 ultimately, but hiring wasn't the only tool we had. Because I'm a very technical person, I could look at this. If I'm more business inclined, maybe I'll look at something else and try to find different ways to go about this. Another thing about hiring that's interesting to me is that, especially these days, it's getting harder and harder to find people who are not your kind of garden variety full stack engineer. Full stack engineers is actually getting easier because the boot camps are getting really good. You can hire people off boot camps, and they're really, if you're using TypeScript especially, they can do stuff. But if you need something more specialized, it's a little more complicated. And this is a problem we had at SoundCloud because, when I joined SoundCloud, we have, I think, 5 million users. Then 1 month later, 10 million. By the time I left, 300 million users. Every week something would break. Just network card saturated. It's the first time I saw that in my life. I didn't even know that was a thing that happened. Um, so we had to hire all these people with skill in scaling up large companies because we were small, but we we're doing big league traffic. Um, I was able to hire a few people from Silicon Valley, mostly Germans who wanted to move back to Germany if there was a good job for them there. We had a few people like this, but it's a finite pool of people. It doesn't really matter how much money you have. Convincing people to move to Berlin, it was very complicated. So then we started working on a strategy, which microservices was ultimately part of. But look at Eastern European countries. So many people. You go to, for example, a Scala meetup in the Ukraine or whatever it was, and it was so full of people. And then you look at these folks, Bulgaria as well. It was a great source for us back in the day. If you look at the companies that were in these countries, they were like, the IBMs and the big banks. So these folks were doing all that amazing stuff on their spare time because the local market didn't have any place that they really wanted to work for. Poland's another example that comes to mind. So we kind of tailored a lot of our recruiting and our strategy around how can we get these folks to, again, move to Berlin within Europe much easier, even if just for a few years. And I focus on getting the Silicon Valley people. We had some people from Google, Twitter, whatever, just to kind of build back to the first question, the platform. So these folks are building, the HTTP client we use because it has all these different controls. And the folks that came without a lot of skill in growing to internet scale systems, they're building features using that and gradually learning more and more about the platform. So I think it's always a red flag for me if somebody's trying to hire hundreds and hundreds of engineers. You probably need people, sure, but that cannot be your golden hammer. That not cannot be your tool, especially because it's impossible to scale a company based on just hiring, especially right now.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, we are reaching the time that we normally place it, 20 minutes. Now we are in 1 hour 7. Do you guys have a last question for Phil?
Yeah, I have one. I'm going to make a technical bit again. I heard you talking about Kubernetes, right? But I think at this point you're using Nomad. I heard you say very quickly between a bunch of things you told back then. So which one do you prefer? And would you still use Kubernetes?
I actually prefer Kubernetes so much more. So I'm biased in a few different reasons. One of them is when I left DigitalOcean, I worked for this small company called Buoyant that does a service mesh called Linkerd. Linkerd is Kubernetes native. I worked a lot on the Kubernetes code base. It's been a while, so I cannot claim that I know the code base anymore, but I am very familiar with the way they go about things, and I like it. Kubernetes can be very hard to operate. I've had a few teams struggling with that in different companies. But ultimately, I think, especially and it's funny because this might be more of a manager answer than a technical answer for me. The way that I talk to my boss about this is, as somebody who was born in 83, I remember as a kid in Brazil where we don't had so much access to electronics back in the day. This to me is similar to when an uncle would go to Japan or something and bring a Super Nintendo for me. And they're like, that's amazing. I have a Super Nintendo with 2 games that I can play, and all these kids on my street have Super Nintendos too, so we can exchange games, right? Except that I had a Japanese Super Nintendo, and they had an American Super Nintendo, and the cartridges don't talk to each other. So if you look at anything, go on Hacker News right now, I can guarantee there's 3 to 5 links about something happening in the Kubernetes community. Yeah. HashiCorp had HashiConf, I think it was last year, and for the first 2 days, they did not talk about Nomad. I forget the name of the CEO who now is the principal engineer. I called them out on Twitter and he replied to me something because as a consumer, I'm not super happy about that. They're happy being the second option, but it gets me really nervous. It's a good piece of software. One of the reasons we ended up with Nomad is because we have a lot of Windows workloads, which Nomad is actually pretty good at managing. But if I had to start from scratch, I'll definitely use Kubernetes. If I have to use a container management thing that I operate, I would look, Fargate and the 35 different things that Amazon has that run containers. Would probably be my first option. But if I have to run something, I prefer to not be with the 20% that run something that's not Kubernetes. I would rather share the pain with everyone, but at the same time share the tooling and the interesting developments.
Okay, cool answer. Thanks.
Pancho?
All right. No, I don't have any other questions. Thanks for being part of our talk, Phil, for now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for joining us. And I will probably ask you to come again. Maybe we're going to have a compensation discussion with different people who has different point of view, if you are up to the game.
After. Also happy to make it a beer podcast. It's more in New York right now, but I will get some alcohol.
We're gonna send it to you. No worries. And I'm gonna close it out. And thanks for Phil, thanks for Sylvester, Pancho, and for the listeners. If you guys have any question, we're gonna add all the show notes, the links that Phil mentioned, his Twitter account, and you can go to podcast.forscout.nl. And you can send your voice so we can play it if you have any questions. And thanks a lot. And see you guys next week.
Bye. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows, with your host, Rolf Surd. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit forscouts.nl and on Twitter @forscouts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows.